By now, I'm sure a lot of you have been seeing headlines like this, and I know it because a lot of folks have been emailing us about headlines like this and the articles attached to them. Basically, assailing plug-in hybrids from both sides of the ideological spectrum. Pro-EV people saying these are nonsensical vehicles. You just should not have a plug-in hybrid. They're terrible, etc. And the other side saying, see, we shouldn't even bother with electrification because they're no better than a regular gasoline vehicle. Well, let's dive into the numbers and talk about what the data and the study and the surveys are saying, importantly, what they are not saying, and why this has nothing to do with the North American car market. First things first, let's read this executive summary here. Basically, this is from transportenvironment.org, I should say. They're a European group here, and they're talking about in 2026, the European Commission is going to review the car CO2 emission standards, the EU's flagship automotive climate and industry policy. While the EC prepares the review, the automotive industry is calling to weaken the regulation by calling to promote and prolong the sales of plug-in hybrid vehicles beyond 2035. And then they talk about the emissions consequences of this. Well, here's the problem. The first one is this is a European study, and we're going to dive into that in a moment. But importantly, it is a European study, not a North American study. And the two car markets are incredibly different, as we're going to discuss in this video. And the problem here is that North American outlets and North American readers have been looking at this study, pointing to the American car market and going, see, I told you so, those plug-in hybrids are bad. This is a much more complicated situation, and there's not as much data going on in the US, which is why this sort of study keeps creeping in and honestly sowing fear, uncertainty, and doubt on the plug-in hybrid semi-segment of electrification. Now, let me go on the record by saying, obviously, if we're concerned about global emissions, long-term emissions, zero emissions vehicles, true zero emissions vehicles are the only way to achieve that goal. But plug-in hybrids can actually reduce your emissions if they are used properly. And that's where this study is important, because it is showing that in Europe, they are not being used properly. We need to talk about that part first. But, big caveat, remember, if you didn't, well, not remember if you didn't know this, but if you didn't know this, more than 60% of cars sold in Europe are owned and registered by companies. They're company cars, and that number is incredibly high in countries like Germany. The reason for that is that in Europe, there's preferential tax treatment for the employer and the employee around the company buying the employee a car, basically giving it to them for the time that they're employed by the company. And there's also incentive for companies to give electric or plug-in hybrid vehicles to the employee. But these employees may live in a variety of different living situations, apartments, townhomes, houses, etc. Generally speaking, though, single-family suburban home ownership is lower in Europe than it is in the US. And by that I mean specifically the construct of American suburbia, where you have a single-family home on a large-ish lot, attached garage, usually multi-car. We're talking about suburbia here. That situation, home ownership is high here as well. That situation, new car buyers can afford and generally can install charging at their home. Remember that new cars in the US are by and large purchased, not exclusively, but generally purchased by upper middle income earners, single family home owners, suburban dwellers, and often dual income families. This is the exact demographic that could install a charger if they want to. And they are selecting their car. They're going out on the market and going, hey, what kind of new car am I looking for? Maybe I'll try one of those plug-in hybrid things. They're making that choice themselves. In Europe, in this situation, this construct, by and large, they are not. Their employer is making this election for them, whether or not the employee has the ability to charge. And in Europe, I think a big flaw with this policy in Europe is twofold. The first one, which they point out in these surveys, that the WLTP rating, which is woefully optimistic. I mean, you think the EPA ratings are insane as far as their estimation for fuel economy and all that. WLTP is even dumber, even more bonkers out there in La La Land. At any rate, So they're saying, WLTP is assuming emissions are going to be here because it's going to be charged all the time and it's going to be driven in these cycles. But in reality, people aren't charging them, so the emissions are much higher. Well, this is where I would say no shit, Sherlock, because you did not provide them with places to charge. The incentive structure in Europe that incentivizes manufacturers to sell plug-in hybrids to companies and companies to buy plug-in hybrids does not include a loop in there to get these companies to provide mass charging for their employees, at least so they could charge them at their workplace. Yes, there is charging going on in Europe, but I would actually argue that generally speaking, plug-in charging and availability in some urban areas may be actually a little bit better than in the US in some areas. But in large areas, it's honestly not. There is a big lack of company charging because there isn't the same drive and the same demographic of I go from my single-family home garage to an enormous roomy parking lot with lots of available power. That situation doesn't exist quite to the same extent in Europe as it does in the US. So it's logical to see why these things aren't being plugged in. Now, why plug-in hybrids and not EVs on the company car side? Well, because companies realize that their employees don't have anywhere to charge the vehicle. So often these companies are saying, we want them to have this perk because everybody's going to get tax benefit from it. So we're going to give them a plug-in hybrid because we know, wink, wink, nod, nod, they're not really going to plug it in, but it gets us the credits. Everybody's happy here in this thing. We can greenwash ourselves, pat ourselves on the back. Fabulous process. That's why this is not great in Europe for emissions, because you are lugging around a battery when you're never charging it, so your emissions are going to be higher than a comparable hybrid. You are greenwashing, which is not really the purpose theoretically of this process. It's to actually improve emissions. Problem. In America, this is not the same construct, but caveat here, or disclaimer, we don't know how often EVs are being really driven on electricity in the United States. We can guess, and we have some survey data around it, but we don't have hard data because car companies are no longer advertising this data from the rooftops. They used to. General Motors and Ford used to tell us how many miles and percent of miles, etc., were being driven in the early Ford Energy products and the Chevy Volt, the one with the V, the plug-in hybrid. And all those numbers indicated really high mileage on electrification, on electricity, to the point almost where you wonder, why are these people not buying a full EV? And we don't know the answer to that. But basically, well over 50% of the miles in those vehicles were electric only. And they had really short ranges, the Ford Energy product. So that's really saying something. I also personally know that I see tons of plug-in hybrids plugged in all over the place. It does seem to be a thing. At the airport, at the mall, lots of plug-in hybrids are around. But again, think about this demographically. In America, the number of company cars is well below 1% as far as a share of new car sales, over 63% in the EU. That's because here there is no tax advantage to the company providing a car to their employee. It's still going to be taxed as income, the actual cost of that vehicle. So there's no point in companies doing it. Companies are buying vehicles for their company fleets. Rental car companies are buying companies for their rental car fleets based on whatever they're doing over there. And then you and I are all running out there buying vehicles based on our personal preferences and our personal belief structure. Now, I will say, I'm driving a plug-in hybrid M5 out there. I would plug it in every day. I don't know if the average M shopper would plug it in every day because they're buying it for the M part, not that other part. And there's only the one M5 out there, the one that has the plug. Similar sort of thing going on with some AMG models. But you know why they exist? They exist because of this EU tax dodge and this problem in Europe. And here I would say plug-in hybrids are a little bit of a problem in the US because of that particular segment. But it's a really small number of sales. Theoretically, here in the US, emissions could be lower if that M5 wasn't a plug-in hybrid, if it had a slightly smaller battery pack and was more of a normal hybrid. Yeah, it would be better. Are we still going to benefit? Who knows? Now, Toyota has said that they have some data on plug-in hybrid utilization, but by and large, they don't have enough. It's not overly complete, and they're not selling it. That is somewhat logical because Toyota does not offer a full connectivity package for these vehicles for an incredibly long period of time. So there's some initial data that they might have, But if the owner chooses not to renew their connectivity package after the trial period, which can be quite short in some vehicles, then they just don't know exactly how they're being used. But J.D. Power does have data on this, and they basically point to the average plug-in hybrid being charged at least 5 days a week. So it seems like it's basically your workday commute. Logical, because these people, again, are buying the vehicle for whatever they're buying it for, whether that is stretching out their gasoline consumption because they want to tiptoe into electrification and they're not sure if they want a full EV and they're treating this like a possible gateway drug. Maybe I'll try a plug-in hybrid. Maybe next time I'll buy a full EV. I actually know a reasonable number of people that did that, specifically with the original Volt. They bought a Volt, then they looked at their usage statistics and they thought, I could actually do this. I could do this EV thing. And then they graduated on to a full EV. That's the sales job of a plug-in hybrid, theoretically. And it does seem to create that funnel, at least on a small scale, in the United States. It does not appear to be doing that in Europe, again, because of how they're buying the vehicles. So here's what I would say. I would caution people that are reading studies like this that are pro-EV and anti-EV. I would caution everybody against reading studies like this and applying these lessons and these statistics to an intrinsically very different car market. The American car market is very different. And I've said I have concerns over that electrified vehicle, that plug-in hybrid or the full EV on its second or third owner, because that's where people that rent homes and apartments generally are. Yes, some people live in apartments and buy new cars. That's not the majority of new car shoppers, and all the data tells us that. But they are the majority of people that are buying used cars. So renters generally buy used cars. And at that point, where are they going to charge their car? We have to address that problem. But for the new car market, theoretically, if our goal is to reduce emissions, then selling RAV4 plug-in hybrids and Sportage plug-in hybrids and Prius plug-in hybrids, that actually makes a lot of sense. The future filled with perhaps less efficient plug-in hybrids or the extended range electric vehicle, I am less interested in some of those. Like a Dodge Ram Charger, I really want to see the numbers on that one, because what's that emissions profile look like? We have a really big heavy battery and a pretty big generator up front. How is that really going to go? Because running on gas, that is not going to be efficient at all. You'd be much better off just having a regular V6 Ram truck. But if you could get someone to then say, maybe I'm only using electricity, maybe next time I'll buy a Ford Lightning, then arguably you have won. At any rate, let me know what you think about all that down there in the comment section below, and let me know if you have seen any good data anywhere out there outside of some of the anecdotes we've seen from manufacturers saying how often their vehicles are plugged in, and the J.D. Power surveys asking consumers how often they plug their hybrid in. It's not hard data, but it does point us into a direction, basically, that what we're seeing in the U.S. is not what we're seeing in Europe. At any rate, let us know down there, and see all of you next week. Keep those questions coming in, of course, too. Bye now.